The rain came down in sheets that morning of January 17, 1943, over the North African coast. Inside a sandstone villa on the outskirts of Casablanca, the scent of strong coffee mingled with the salt air drifting through half-open shutters. Two men sat across from one another at a table scarred by years of colonial use, maps spread between them like ancient parchments revealing the fate of continents. Outside, jeeps rumbled past, security officers paced in nervous patterns. The world did not yet know what was being decided in that room, but those who would later learn of it, generals, strategists, intelligence chiefs, would carry the weight of that conversation for the rest of their lives. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill had met before. They had exchanged letters, spoken over crackling transatlantic lines, shared cigars and whiskey in the quiet hours when the burden of war felt most unbearable. But this meeting was different. This was the moment when the full scope of American industrial power and the audacity of its deployment was laid bare before the British leader. Not in abstract terms, not in optimistic projections, but in cold, undeniable numbers that defied every assumption Churchill had held about the limits of modern warfare. Roosevelt leaned back in his chair, his legs braced beneath the table, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into his face. He reached for a folder, thick with documents, and slid it across the polished wood. Churchill opened it slowly, his thick fingers tracing the columns of figures: aircraft production, tank output, Liberty ship construction rates, munitions manufacturing. The numbers climbed page after page, each one more staggering than the last. Churchill's cigar hung forgotten between his lips, ash growing long, the smoke curling upward in the stillness. "Franklin," Churchill said at last, his voice low, almost reverent, "these figures, are they accurate?" Roosevelt nodded. "Verified by the War Production Board and their conservative estimates." Churchill set the folder down, removed his cigar, and stared at the American president. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The rain drummed against the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a Moroccan vendor shouted in Arabic, his voice rising and falling like a muezzin's call. Churchill had seen the Battle of Britain. He had watched London burn. He had rallied a nation on the brink of annihilation and held the line when all of Europe had fallen. But this was something else entirely. This was the industrial engine of a continent channeled into a single unified purpose. This was what it looked like when a democracy weaponized its freedom. "You're going to bury them," Churchill said quietly. "You're going to bury them under steel and fire until they can't breathe." Roosevelt's expression didn't change, but his eyes held a flicker of something. Resolve, perhaps, or grim satisfaction. "We're going to give them no choice but to surrender or die trying." To understand why this meeting shocked the Allied command, one must first understand what the world believed about America in the early years of the war. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the United States was a slumbering giant. Its military ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Romania's. Its industry was vast but fragmented, still recovering from the Depression, focused on consumer goods rather than instruments of destruction. Isolationism dominated American politics. The idea that this nation, wealthy but unmilitarized, powerful but reluctant, could become the arsenal of democracy seemed to most European observers like wishful thinking. Even after Pearl Harbor, even after America declared war and began mobilizing, the skepticism persisted. The British had been fighting for 2 years. The Soviets were bleeding out on the Eastern Front. The assumption, shared by ally and enemy alike, was that American industry would take years to retool, that training an army would consume precious time, that logistical nightmares would strangle any attempt at rapid deployment. The Germans calculated that they could defeat the Soviet Union before American strength became relevant. The Japanese believed they could fortify the Pacific and make any American counteroffensive too costly to sustain. Both underestimated what Roosevelt was about to unleash.
What Churchill saw in that folder was the fruit of a transformation unprecedented in human history. In less than 2 years, America had converted its peacetime autonomy into a war machine operating at a scale that defied comprehension. Automobile factories that once produced sedans now churned out tanks and aircraft engines. Shipyards that had built luxury liners now assembled Liberty ships in 42 days. Women who had never worked outside the home riveted bomber fuselages. Farmers' sons became pilots. A nation of jazz and Hollywood and baseball had become a nation of munitions, logistics, and relentless grinding output. The numbers Roosevelt presented were not aspirational. They were actual production figures from 1942 and projections for 1943 that would prove conservative. In 1942 alone, American factories produced 47,836 aircraft, more than Germany and Japan combined. Tank production reached 24,997 units. Liberty ships rolled off the slipways at a rate of 3 per day. By the end of 1943, the United States would manufacture more war materiel than all Axis powers combined. This wasn't just an advantage, it was a deluge. Churchill had hoped for American support. What he discovered in Casablanca was that America intended to win the war through sheer, overwhelming abundance. The German High Command had contingency plans for many scenarios. They had calculated the risks of a two-front war. They had prepared for Soviet resilience, for British stubbornness, for partisan resistance in occupied territories, but they had not prepared for this. Intelligence reports filtering back from the front began to paint a picture that defied German experience. Allied forces, particularly American units, seemed to operate under different rules of supply and logistics. A German tank commander captured in Tunisia in early 1943 described his bewilderment during interrogation. His Panzer Division had been cut off, low on fuel, rationing ammunition. They had expected the Allies to be in similar straits. This was the nature of modern warfare, the logistical chess game where supply lines determined survival. Instead, the American units they engaged seemed to have limitless resources.
They fired artillery barrages that lasted hours. They called in air support as casually as ordering breakfast. When their tanks were damaged, new ones appeared within days. The German officer shook his head in disbelief. "It's as if they can afford to waste everything," he said, "as if the war is just easy for them." This was the psychological shock that accompanied American industrial power. It wasn't merely that the United States could produce more, it was that this abundance changed the nature of combat itself. German soldiers were trained to conserve ammunition, to make every shot count, to treat equipment as precious and irreplaceable. American soldiers were trained to use firepower liberally, to call in artillery and air support without hesitation, to trust that supplies would continue to flow. The contrast was ideological as much as material. Fascism demanded sacrifice and scarcity. Democracy delivered abundance. The symbolism was not lost on those who witnessed it. In prisoner of war camps, German soldiers were given rations that exceeded what they had received in their own army. They were given cigarettes, coffee, chocolate, luxuries that had disappeared from Germany years before. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could the enemy, supposedly weak and decadent, provide better care for prisoners than the Reich provided for its own troops? The answer was uncomfortable. Because they could afford to. Because their system produced surplus even in the midst of total war. Japanese soldiers experienced a similar shock, though filtered through a different cultural lens. The Japanese military culture emphasized self-sacrifice, endurance, and the acceptance of deprivation as a virtue. Soldiers were expected to fight to the death, to view surrender as dishonor, to survive on minimal rations. When Japanese forces encountered American troops in the Pacific, the material disparity was even more stark than in Europe. American Marines had hot meals delivered to the front. They had medical supplies, clean water, ammunition in quantities that seemed obscene.
captured Japanese diaries reveal a recurring theme: disbelief that such abundance could coexist with military effectiveness. One diary entry, recovered from Guadalcanal, is particularly telling. A Japanese lieutenant wrote of watching American ships unload supplies on the beach, crate after crate, truck after truck, an endless stream of materiel. "They fight as if they have already won," he observed, "as if the outcome is certain, and this is merely procedure. There is no desperation in them, only routine." The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. It wasn't just that Japan was losing, it was that Japan had never had a chance. Inside the Allied command structure, the Casablanca meeting became a turning point. Before that conference, there had been debates about strategy, about priorities, about whether to focus on Europe or the Pacific, whether to invade North Africa or France. These debates were rooted in the assumption of limited resources, of hard choices between competing objectives. After Casablanca, the conversation shifted. The question was no longer what the Allies could afford to do, it was what they would choose to do with resources that seemed almost inexhaustible. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, had arrived at Casablanca with detailed plans.
General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, had arrived at Casablanca with detailed plans for a cross-channel invasion of France. The British, scarred by the memory of World War I's trench slaughter, were cautious, advocating for peripheral strategies: North Africa, Sicily, Italy. The debate was heated, technical, strategic, but beneath it lay a revelation that changed the calculus. America could do both. It could fight in the Mediterranean and prepare for Normandy. It could supply the British and the Soviets while building its own forces. The logistical constraints that had governed every previous war did not apply. Churchill understood this intellectually, but the emotional impact took longer to absorb. In his memoirs, he would later write about the Casablanca Conference with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "I had not fully grasped," he admitted, "the scale of what our American friends were attempting. They spoke of production targets as we might speak of tea rations, casually, confidently, as if doubling the output of entire industries were a matter of minor adjustment. I began to understand that we were not simply gaining an ally. We were witnessing the mobilization of an entire continent's resources toward a single goal." The realization rippled through the British command. Generals who had grown accustomed to scarcity, to making do, to improvising with limited resources, suddenly had to recalibrate their thinking. Planning sessions took on a different character. What do we need became a more relevant question than what can we afford? The psychological shift was profound. For 3 years, Britain had fought a war of survival. Now, allied with America, it was fighting a war of annihilation. Soviet leaders experienced a different kind of shock. Stalin was suspicious by nature, paranoid by training, and skeptical of Western promises. When Roosevelt and Churchill pledged to supply the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program, Stalin assumed it would be a token gesture, a symbolic support that would collapse under the weight of logistical impossibility. The Arctic convoys that began arriving in Murmansk told a different story. American trucks, hundreds of thousands of them, sturdy Studebakers that could navigate Russian mud and snow, canned food, boots, aluminum, steel, aircraft. The supplies kept coming, month after month, an endless stream that defied weather, U-boats, and distance. Soviet soldiers began driving American trucks, eating American rations, wearing American boots. The material impact was enormous, but the psychological impact was equally significant. It forced a grudging acknowledgement. The Americans were serious. They had the capacity not only to fight their own war, but to sustain their allies on a scale that bordered on the absurd. Even Stalin, who trusted no one, had to admit that American industry was delivering on its promises.
The recurring symbol of this abundance, the object that came to represent American power more than any weapon, was not a tank or a bomber. It was food. Throughout the war, as Axis soldiers grew thinner, as rations shrank and substitutes replaced staples, American soldiers ate well. Not just adequately, well. Hot meals in the field, coffee that was actually coffee, not roasted grain, chocolate bars, canned fruit, white bread. The famous C rations and K rations were mocked by troops as monotonous, but to enemy soldiers, they were a revelation. A single K ration contained more calories and better nutrition than many German or Japanese soldiers received in a full day. Captured German officers, interrogated in England or North Africa, often fixated on food. They asked about it, marveled at it, tried to reconcile it with their understanding of war. How could a nation at war produce such abundance? Where was the sacrifice, the rationing, the collective suffering that war demanded? The answer was unsettling. America didn't need to ration most foods because it produced more than it could consume. The war effort was immense, but it didn't require the civilian population to starve. It didn't require soldiers to fight hungry. This was ideological warfare of the subtlest kind. Every well-fed American soldier was proof that democracy could wage war without devouring its own citizens. Every care package sent home, every letter describing hot meals and coffee was evidence that the American system could fight total war while maintaining a standard of living that Axis nations couldn't match even in peacetime. In POW camps, the contrast became stark. German prisoners in American camps were given rations equivalent to what American soldiers ate: meat, vegetables, bread, dessert. Many gained weight in captivity. Letters home described meals that seemed fantastical to families in Germany surviving on turnips and sawdust bread. The propaganda value was secondary to the simple reality: America could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany fed its soldiers. Japanese prisoners, fewer in number due to cultural prohibitions against surrender, experienced an even more profound cognitive dissonance. Raised in a culture that valorized deprivation, taught that endurance of suffering was the highest virtue, they found themselves in camps where food was plentiful, where medical care was provided, where captors treated them with a casual decency that contradicted everything they had been told about American barbarism. Some broke psychologically, unable to reconcile the reality with the ideology they had internalized. Others quietly reevaluated the teachings they had received.
The food was a symbol, but it represented something deeper: the fundamental difference between systems. Fascism and militarism demanded sacrifice, scarcity, and suffering as proof of virtue. Democracy, for all its flaws, operated on the assumption that abundance was possible, that citizens could be prosperous and strong, that war did not require starvation. The Axis powers had built their empires on the belief that resources were finite, that survival required conquest. America's industrial output suggested an alternative, that prosperity could be created, that wealth could be generated, that abundance was a product of freedom and innovation rather than theft and domination. As the war progressed, the full scope of what had been decided at Casablanca became clear. The invasion of Sicily, the Italian campaign, the preparation for D-Day, the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, the strategic bombing of Germany, the atomic bomb program. Each of these required resources that would have bankrupted any previous military power. Together, they represented a level of simultaneous effort that redefined what was militarily possible. Allied soldiers began to take the abundance for granted. It became normal to have air superiority, normal to receive supplies, normal to expect reinforcements. The Germans and Japanese, by contrast, grew increasingly desperate. Supply lines stretched thin. Equipment broke down and couldn't be replaced. Fuel became scarce. Ammunition was rationed. The material disparity widened month by month, battle by battle, until the outcome was inevitable. German generals, interviewed after the war, often pointed to Casablanca as the moment when the war was truly lost, not because of any specific battle or strategic decision, but because it was when the full weight of American industrial power became clear.
"We could fight the British," one said. "We could fight the Soviets, but we could not fight American factories. They buried us in steel." Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied in America and understood its potential, had warned before Pearl Harbor, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." By 1943, that fear had proven prophetic. The giant was not only awake, but moving with a speed and power that defied all pre-war calculations. Japanese strategists had assumed America would grow tired, that the distances were too great, that the will to fight would falter. They had not accounted for the possibility that America would simply outlast them through sheer productive capacity. The transformation was visible everywhere. In the skies over Germany, where 1,000 bomber raids became routine. In the Atlantic, where U-boats that had once hunted freely were now hunted themselves by aircraft, destroyers, and escort carriers produced faster than they could be sunk. In the Pacific, where entire fleets materialized as if conjured from nowhere, replacing losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The war became less a contest of skill or courage and more a grinding calculus of production versus attrition, a calculus the Axis could not win.
Churchill left Casablanca with a different understanding of his ally. He had known America was wealthy, had hoped it would be generous, had believed it could be powerful, but he had not fully grasped that it would be decisive. The meeting changed him, gave him a confidence he had not felt since the dark days of 1940. Britain would survive. The alliance would prevail, not through luck or heroism alone, but through the overwhelming application of industrial might that America had unleashed. Roosevelt, for his part, understood the burden he was placing on his nation. Total mobilization came at a cost, social, economic, human. But he believed in the cause, believed that fascism had to be defeated utterly, believed that the only way to ensure lasting peace was through complete victory. The meeting with Churchill reaffirmed his commitment. The path forward was clear: produce, supply, deploy, overwhelm. The staff officers who were briefed after the meeting carried the knowledge like a secret, electrifying and heavy. They returned to their commands, adjusted their plans, expanded their ambitions. The war would still be long, still be bloody, still demand sacrifice, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was not whether the Allies would win, but how quickly and at what cost. The rain stopped on the evening of January 18th. Churchill and Roosevelt stood together on the villa's terrace, looking out over the Atlantic. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays across the water. Ships moved in the harbor below, transport vessels unloading supplies, warships standing guard. The scene was peaceful, almost serene, a moment of calm in the midst of catastrophe. "It's a strange thing," Churchill said quietly, "to feel hope in the middle of such darkness." Roosevelt nodded, his hands gripping the terrace railing. "The darkness will get worse before it lifts, but it will lift." They stood in silence, two men bearing the weight of millions, watching the light play across the water. Behind them, aides sorted documents, planned itineraries, coordinated security. The machinery of war churned on, relentless and vast. But in that moment, there was stillness, a brief respite before the next wave of decisions, the next crisis, the next battle. History would remember Casablanca for the declaration of unconditional surrender, for the strategic debates, for the photographs of Churchill and Roosevelt seated together in the Moroccan sun. But those who were there, those who saw the documents, who understood the numbers, who grasped the full scope of what was being unleashed, they remembered it differently. They remembered it as the moment when the war's outcome became certain, when the sleeping giant revealed not just its strength, but its terrible, inexhaustible resolve.
The Germans would fight on for another 2 years, the Japanese for 2.5. They would inflict casualties, win battles, defy predictions of collapse. But they were fighting an enemy that could replace every loss, repair every ship, rebuild every airfield, and train every replacement faster than they could inflict damage. They were fighting an enemy that treated war as a production problem, and production was what America did better than any nation in history. The private meeting in Casablanca shocked the Allied command, not because it revealed something new about strategy or tactics, but because it revealed something fundamental about power. Power was not just courage or skill or determination. Power was the capacity to sustain effort, to absorb loss, to continue fighting long after others would have collapsed. Power was the ability to feed soldiers, supply armies, build fleets, and do it all simultaneously while maintaining civilian morale and economic stability. In that villa, on that rainy morning in January, Franklin Roosevelt showed Winston Churchill what American power looked like when fully mobilized. And Churchill, veteran of empires, witness to history's great conflicts, architect of resistance against tyranny, understood that he was seeing something unprecedented. Not just an ally, but a force of nature. Not just a partner in war, but a glimpse of the future. A future where democracy's ability to generate abundance would prove as decisive as any battlefield valor. The meeting ended. The two men returned to their separate commands, their separate nations, their separate burdens. But they carried with them the knowledge that the war, for all its remaining horror, had already been decided. It had been decided in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, the training camps of Texas. It had been decided by a nation that had turned its prosperity into a weapon and its freedom into an engine of destruction aimed at those who would destroy freedom. The Axis would learn what Churchill learned that morning in Casablanca, that America at war was not just another belligerent, another player in the game of nations. It was the game's end, the equation's solution, the force that rewrote the rules through sheer, overwhelming abundance. And there was no strategy, no tactic, no amount of courage or fanaticism that could overcome it. The rain returned that night, washing the Moroccan coast clean, drumming against the roof where two men had sat and discussed the fate of the world. By morning, they would be gone, returning to London and Washington, to the endless work of war. But the numbers remained, inked on pages, verified and undeniable. The giant was awake, and the world would never be the same.